Okay, I kind of got the idea this might be a cool idea to show off a few things here. So I just did a test video, and it turns out that the microphone on the laptop appears to be very, very good because I can be heard all the way across my room. Now, for some of you who may be thinking he's moving a little awkwardly or whatever, my bed is literally right here, and this used to be a garage that was kind of renovated to become a room. So there's this little step right here in front of where I've got the computer set up. So you literally, I can't move here. Of course, this is like right on top of the computer, so I wouldn't want to do that anyway. But I can't move to my right without jumping up on top of the bed. And there's a fan right here, and of course, as you can tell, this is a wall. But, well, quick introduction first, really quick. This is Cold Steel's Kopis machete, based off of a Greco-Iberian weapon, very famous slasher hacker, used as like a cavalry saber, and by infantry as well, light infantry. Just to kind of show off the blade, it's extremely sharp. This is possibly the best cutter that I have got. It's got this recurved blade which puts all of the weight out here towards the end. Sometimes the Kopis is compared to like a combination between a sickle, an axe, and a spear. That's because you've got this kind of curved inward cutting edge right here, which can do some great slicing. This big heavy chopping edge up here, which can put a lot of percussive power, and this point here on the end, which, because of the way the blade is shaped and made, can still have a lot of very powerful thrusting ability out of it. So, but primarily what this is used for, and you can tell this by the hook-shaped grip, sometimes called a semi-D ring. It was primarily used for big, sweeping cuts like this. Now, I will point out, of course, that a real Kopis was quite a bit heavier than this, probably 2 to 3 pounds. And it would have been fairly blade heavy because of the big wide front right here. So again, very useful. Useful in a cut. I mean, there are stories from ancient Rome during the Punic Wars of Iberian cavalrymen. For those who don't know, Iberia was basically ancient Spain. There are stories from the Romans at that time of Iberian cavalrymen and even infantrymen using these, what they called, or what's been translated at least, as Hispanian sabers. The Iberian one was oftentimes called a falcata, although that's probably a later term. Probably at the time they actually probably would have referred to them by the Greek term kopis. There are stories, though, of them splitting the Romans' helmets, which of course at that time would have been probably bronze. But still, bronze can be a pretty tough metal. And these iron swords would just, or some of them were probably made out of Toledo steel, would just cleave right through the middle of them with no problem, especially if they came in off of horseback, you know, and rode in and cleaved downwards with them. This version, the Kopis machete from Cold Steel, as you can tell, I have the camera reversed so that it actually comes out properly, so my left hand looks like my left hand. Problem is that it throws my directions off a little. But as you can probably tell, this blade is ridiculously thin. In fact, if I turn it the right way, it will probably almost disappear. I think it's just maybe right around 2 millimeters thick, so it's really thin. This thing weighs, I think, under a pound. So it's really fast in the hand. You know, really fast, very light and flexible, very quick to move with in a lot of different ways. But by itself, the one thing you'll notice is that as light as it is, you don't have a lot of reach because it is just barely over 2 feet, the sword is. It's 26 inches. So you don't got a ton of reach. Basically, you get about around 5 feet of reach, roughly, with this weapon. You also don't really have, I mean, you got decent hand protection, but not perfect. This is definitely not like a cross guard where, you know, you can catch anything on it. Basically, if another person's blade, or in this modern day and age, say another machete, a knife, a baseball bat, pipe, something like that, were to slide down this, if it were to slide down on the front, it would catch the D-ring and just probably kind of flip off. But if you had it angled wrong, it could flip off and hit you. If it slides down the back, it's going to hit your hand. So, and of course, same thing down the sides, it's going to hit your hand. So you don't really have a lot of defense with this for a self-defense situation, other than movement. You literally have to kind of parry and riposte, literally just knock their weapon aside and counter as quickly as you could, as fast as you could to, parry it aside and then turn and cut, which that is where the lightness does come in handy. And even this curved blade, if you were to parry with it and catch their weapon in that curve, it'd make it easier to knock it aside and then reverse and come in with a cut. And I mean, even a false edge, there is no false edge on this. It's blunt right here across the back, all the way down to the point. But even a reverse cut like that with this weapon, because it's so thin, it'd still hurt really bad, and it could even cut them, especially with how pointy the tip is. It would definitely do a lot of damage. But I would not feel safe. I'm pretty quick on my feet for a guy my size, but I still wouldn't feel really safe using this all by itself. I would if I had to, but I wouldn't feel the maximum space of safe, especially in a tight environment like this where I can't really do a lot of sidestepping. This is literally about as much sidestepping in here as I can do. This is like the most open area in the room, and it's basically just right through here, between that step up I told you about and my bed. So this is literally the only place where I have a lot of movement room from side to side. When it gets up in here, you've got the step to worry about, and you've got the bed, and even all through the house, you've got furniture and tight corridors and stuff like that. So I'd want something to protect myself with in the other hand. What would I use? You might have noticed it by now. It's right back here. This is also Cold Steel. This is Cold Steel's training buckler. I have it put up on a little leather thong here. I think it's leather, it might be suede, to just hang it from the wall. This thing weighs a little over a pound. It's actually a really nice buckler. They tell you not to use it with any kind of actual bladed weapons, which of course they would damage it, but I would not be afraid at all to take this thing up against even something as sharp as this, or a lot heavier. It would damage it to get hit by it, but it would stop it, especially if you were using it properly. Now, a lot of people will look at this thing and they'll say, that's really small for a shield. That's because they've got video game ideas in their mind, or Hollywood, where you hold the shield really close in like this and you make these big sweeping motions, and sometimes even do this number where you move the shield back behind yourself when you're cutting, because wow, doesn't that look cool? It's like he's fencing, but he's got this cool looking shield back behind his back when it's not doing anything. Maybe he's trying to protect himself from behind, which isn't going to do shit if the guy in front of him decides to step around and stab him. That's not the way you use a buckler. Not the way you use any shield. You always keep the shield in front of yourself. But with the buckler, it's so small, but I want you to notice something. This is a little trick of physics. I hold the buckler directly in front of myself. This buckler is I think it's exactly 1 foot in diameter. That's how big the circle it protects is. But if I move it outwards, the amount of me that it covers grows. It gets a lot bigger, doesn't it? A lot bigger, the further out it gets. That's the trick with using one of these. When you're facing your opponent, you don't hold it in close. You can, but it works better if you hold it out in front of yourself like this, so that you can deflect blows that are incoming. And it's actually advised that you don't use it against blows coming in low, because it's so small you can't reach down to block ones coming at your legs. It's advised that you either do a slip, which you can't really see, but basically it's where you're facing your opponent and you just step back with your lead leg. He aims a cut down low at your lead leg and you just step out of the way, which is oftentimes accompanied by a cut. You step out of the way and cut at the same time, because he exposes himself. If he makes a cut down low at your leg, he's doing this, so he's kind of exposing his upper body, so you just step back and cut at the upper body. The way you would use this in conjunction with the sword is you would use them both together. You would literally keep the shield out and the sword out, and you keep them together, and you would do things like this, where you're cutting or thrusting out from behind the blade. Even if you start in a back stance like this, like on tag, you would strike forward at your opponent, and you keep that shield in place, that buckler in place to cover that hand. A lot of people consider the buckler to be a sort of pre-steel plate gauntlet. It was used not so much to protect the body, it could be, but mostly you relied on movement and so on to protect your body. I'll get into more here in a minute. But the buckler was primarily there to protect your sword hand, which is an extremely exposed thing. Anyone who practices sword fighting will tell you that hand is very exposed. You are very likely, if you get into like a bind or something where your blades are pressed together and you get to trying to wind around and your opponent slips down and strikes at the wrong moment, he can cut your hand. Even with a blunt weapon, it can damage you. I know for a fact that like Matt Easton on YouTube has done a video before showing where he was doing saber fencing, and this was with a saber that has a kind of an enclosed grip, kind of like this one does. A little bit better than this, actually. And he got a couple of fingers broken. I think Scalagram also hurt himself in a video once, or did a video showing that he'd gotten hurt in the hand while sparring, and this was with safe training weapons. I say safe, meaning, you know, they're not going to kill you, but they could still hurt. So when you're actually using real steel in an actual fight, and things are moving like that really quickly, so fast my camera doesn't even seem able to keep up with it, it's very easy for that exposed weapon hand, if it's out in the open and exposed, to get hurt, because it's the thing that's out in front when you strike. Even if you're using classical techniques where the weapon is usually back here towards your body, you've got to extend it to make the strike, and in that moment your arm and hand are both exposed and vulnerable. So you use the buckler to cover it, usually on the top, sometimes to the sides, but usually on the top where it can cover. You know, so when you strike into the cover of the buckler. For instance, first ward is with the sword back here like this, basically the same as it would be as if it was in a scabbard. And they say Europeans don't know how to do a quick draw with a sword blade. I want to point that out real quick. The Japanese with Aido were not the only ones to practice techniques that revolved around drawing the sword quickly from the scabbard and making a cut. Because Europeans had first ward, which starts in this position where the sword would be if it was in the scabbard. And then it goes from there into like you drew the sword and made a cut. The difference being when you draw and make the cut, you literally cover yourself. Basically, you would move the buckler to cover that hand. Unless you saw your opponent's blade over in here as you made that cut, you would move the buckler. It seems to expose yourself, but you're blocking his blade. If he moves his blade, if he tries to move it up and over, you follow it. And you don't just use the buckler for that, you also use the sword. You move it in with the buckler. Basically, the way I heard it described in a video once is basically when you're sword fighting with sword and buckler, your opponent makes his attacks, you parry just like you would with the sword. If he makes an overhand cut at you, then you parry just like you would with the sword, except that you have the buckler there to back it up. So basically his sword kind of gets caught in that crook between the sword blade and the buckler's curve. It gets caught there. And then you can use the buckler, you kind of pull your sword blade away and move the buckler in to kind of push against his sword to bind it, to keep it out of the way. Or you can use both of them. You know, like from here you could just slide right down his sword blade into a cut, while keeping the buckler there to bind his sword in place and cut down. If it's a low cut, you block with the sword. You know, you block with the sword. Say he comes in with a cut like this, down at your left side. You block with the sword, and then move the buckler into place to hold it there. You could even use both together to lift his sword up and out of the way to come in under for a cut. That's getting a little fancy though. The point is you move the buckler in to block his sword and then take yours away to make your counter strike. You don't leave yourself unprotected, and you try to bind his blade to keep it out of the way. For instance, he goes in for a high cut, and you bind up here. You can either cut down across his body, or you can just slide down and cut his exposed sword arm. It's important to note, damn it, I'm nearly out of time. It's important to note that in Talhofer's manuals for sword and buckler fencing, he talks about, well, he doesn't talk about it, it's in the artwork. It always shows the guy who's winning in the matchups that you see always has the sword and buckler together like this, whereas the guy who loses usually doesn't. They're apart. So, out of time for this one. Let me know if you want to see another one like this, and I'll make it. Ta-ta.